I want you to picture a very specific, a very familiar moment.
Okay.
You're standing outside right after a massive, violent summer storm has finally broken. You know the exact atmosphere I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The air gets really heavy.
Right. The air is suddenly significantly cooler. It smells sharply of ozone and like wet asphalt.
Yeah.
And those heavy, dark clouds are just starting to pull apart. You look up, and right there, arcing across the clearing sky, is a rainbow.
It's a great image.
It is universally recognized across cultures. It's a
Good.
symbol of hope, a sign of the storm passing, of survival. And if you look historically, specifically at the text in the book of Genesis, it is famously presented as a divine promise.
The covenant.
Right,
Mhm.
exactly, a covenant. But what if we've been reading that entirely wrong? Or, well, more accurately, what if we haven't been reading it literally enough?
That's the real question here.
Right. Like, why was God so intensely specific when he pointed to the bow in the cloud as a promise for future generations? What if that specific symbol wasn't just some beautiful, poetic metaphor that was chosen at random?
Mhm.
What if the sudden appearance of a rainbow was a literal physical impossibility before that exact moment in planetary history?
It completely flips the narrative on its head.
Yeah.
I mean, we are so incredibly used to thinking of the rainbow as just a baseline phenomenon of nature.
Totally.
We assume that it has simply always existed, going all the way back to the dawn of the Earth, as long as there's been light and water.
Right, because why wouldn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the sources we are unpacking today suggest something radically different. They suggest that when that first rainbow appeared, it was a brand new physical manifestation.
And that is exactly what we are going to explore today in this deep dive. We're getting into a massive stack of incredibly fascinating sources, primarily centered around an alternative framework known as the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or UTGH for short.
Along with a companion text called Earth, a biography of chaos.
Yes, exactly. We're going to unpack exactly why the bow in the cloud was chosen as a covenant. And what is so compelling about this is that we're going to see how the sheer elementary physics of a rainbow might actually unlock a radical, highly specific framework for understanding the biological and geological nature of the pre-flood world.
It really is a remarkable piece of reverse engineering.
It is.
The authors of these sources are essentially using a single atmospheric optical phenomenon to reconstruct an entire lost biosphere. They're working backward from the rainbow to figure out what the atmosphere had to look like to, prevent one from forming.
Now, real quick, I want to be entirely clear with everyone listening before we really get going. We are looking at a wildly alternative framework today.
Very alternative.
Yeah. These sources blend ancient religious texts like Genesis, the Book of Job, the ancient genealogies, with a highly specific alternative geological and physical framework. So we aren't here to debate mainstream geology or push any sort of theology or anything like that. We are simply cracking open this specific source material to see how its internal physics engine works.
Because honestly, the math and the logic they used to build this pre-flood world is absolutely fascinating.
It really is. Whether you buy into the conclusions or not, we just want to impartially explore the ideas and the physical mechanisms they are proposing.
And it is worth noting that the internal logic of this framework is incredibly intricate.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't just stop at theology. It weaves together thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, biology, orbital mechanics, and ancient linguistics into one cohesive model.
So we're going to go on a bit of a journey. We'll start with the raw physics of light and water. Then we'll try to figure out what kind of sky could possibly make a rainbow impossible.
Which gets pretty weird.
Very weird. It's going to lead us into a world of giant bugs, 70-ton dinosaurs, and humans supposedly living for centuries. And finally, we will look at the exact mechanical trigger that these sources claim shattered that ancient world, producing the very first rain, and consequently, the very first rainbow.
So let's start with the rainbow itself.
Okay, let's do it. In Genesis 8 and 9, the text is very explicit. It specifies that God set his bow in the cloud as a sign of the covenant never to destroy the earth by water again.
And the sources make a massive foundational claim right here. They argue this was not an arbitrary symbol.
It wasn't just a pretty natural occurrence given a new meaning.
Exactly. It was physically precise. To really grasp the significance of that claim, we have to strip away all the poetry, all the cultural baggage, and just look at the raw optics.
Okay.
A rainbow is not a physical object in the sky. You can't fly a plane over it or touch it.
Right, it's just light.
It is strictly an optical phenomenon. And for you, as an observer, to see a rainbow, Two highly specific environmental conditions must exist simultaneously.
Okay, what are they?
First, you need a point source of light, which in our case is direct, unbroken sunlight.
Direct sunlight, got it.
Second, you need discrete, spherical, airborne water droplets suspended in the atmosphere between you and that sun.
Which usually means active or very recently active rainfall.
Exactly.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's not enough for there just to be moisture in the air. Like, I don't see a rainbow on a really humid summer day just because there's water vapor around.
Right. The water cannot just be vapor, and it cannot just be dense fog either. It has to be falling, discrete droplets.
Yeah.
It is an exact geometry problem.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, when a direct beam of sunlight hits one of these falling spherical drops of water, the light enters the drop. As it moves from the less dense air into the denser water, it slows down.
Oh, right.
And this change in speed causes the light to bend, a process we call refraction.
Like when you look at a straw in a glass of water and the straw looks broken or bent at the surface?
That is the exact same principle, yes.
Yep.
So the sunlight refracts as it enters the droplet. Then that bent light travels through the water and hits the back of the droplet. Instead of passing through, it reflects off the inside back surface of the water, bouncing back toward the front of the drop.
So it bounces inside the raindrop.
Yes. And as it exits the droplet and goes back into the air, it speeds up and refracts a second time.
So the light is bending twice and bouncing once.
Yes. And here's where the magic happens.
Right.
White sunlight is made up of all the colors of the visible spectrum.
Right.
Because different colors of light, like different wavelengths, bend at slightly different angles when they refract. That double bending process separates the white light out into its constituent colors.
Red bends the least, violet bends the most.
Exactly. For a primary rainbow, this separated light returns to the observer's eye at a very specific characteristic angle, which is roughly 42 degrees from the path of the incoming sunlight.
Wow. Okay, so it really is incredibly precise.
Highly precise.
You need a direct beam coming in, a discrete droplet to act as a prism, that double refraction and reflection, and then it beams back at exactly a 42-degree angle to my eye.
Precisely. If you do not have direct sunlight, or if you do not have discrete spherical water droplets suspended in the air, that geometry instantly breaks.
The physics just can't happen.
Right. And what the unified theory framework argues is that in the pre-flood world, these two conditions never coexisted.
Okay.
Therefore, a rainbow was not just a rare occurrence. It was a literal, mathematical, physical impossibility.
Okay, hold on. Let me just pause and push back on this a bit, because I know anyone listening is probably thinking the exact same thing right now.
Sure.
If there is water on a planet and there is a sun in the sky, how can a rainbow be impossible? Are these sources suggesting the pre-flood world was entirely dark? Or that there was no water?
No, not at all.
Because obviously things were growing.
The texts clearly describe a lush world. They had plenty of light, and they had immense amounts of water. But the sources argue that the state of that light and the state of that water were fundamentally different than anything we experience in our modern climate.
I was trying to wrap my head around this while reading through the materials. How do you have a bright sun but no direct sunlight?
It's hard to visualize.
It is. And the best analogy I could think of is being inside a massive, brightly lit, frosted glass globe.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, if you are standing inside a sphere made of frosted glass and someone turns on a massive stadium floodlight outside of it, the inside of your globe is going to be incredibly bright.
Right.
You can see your hands, you can read a book, there's plenty of illumination, but you can't actually see the shape of the bulb itself.
Exactly.
And more importantly, there are no direct, unbroken beams of light piercing through to cast sharp shadows. The light hits the frosted glass and scatters in a billion different directions.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. In optical physics, we refer to that as a diffused light environment.
A diffused light environment.
Yes. In a diffused light environment, the precise 42-degree refraction geometry required for a rainbow simply cannot form.
Wow, okay.
Even if you had falling rain inside your frosted glass globe, the light is striking those water droplets from millions of scattered random angles simultaneously.
Oh, so it just washes it out.
It completely washes out any coherent spectral reflection. You would never get the rainbow.
Okay, so that explains the light side of the equation. But to understand why the sky was acting like frosted glass and why there were no discrete raindrops falling from it, we have to look at the specific atmospheric parameters these sources outline for this ancient Earth.
And they don't just use vague mythological terms. They put very hard scientific numbers on this.
They do, and that is what makes this framework so unique to analyze. The UTGH framework proposes a highly calibrated, interconnected physical model.
According to these sources, the pre-flood atmosphere operated at a vastly different pressure than ours.
How different?
They calculate a total atmospheric pressure of 1.5 to 2.0 atmospheres, with a central estimate of 1.8 atmospheres.
Okay, to give you some perspective on that, our current atmospheric pressure at sea level right now is exactly 1.0 atmosphere. So they are saying the air was nearly twice as thick.
Considerably thicker, yes. And atmospheric pressure isn't just a number. It dictates how much of other substances the air can hold.
Like water.
Exactly. Because this atmosphere was at 1.8 atmospheres of pressure, it had a vastly increased capacity for holding moisture. The framework specifies that this entire atmospheric column was continuously heavily laden with water vapor.
So it wasn't like today, where you have mostly clear skies and then a discrete, puffy cumulus cloud rolls in and dumps rain.
No, the moisture wasn't gathered into isolated moving cloud systems at all.
Okay.
The moisture was uniformly distributed throughout the entire height and breadth of the atmospheric column. It was a globally saturated sky.
Which perfectly explains the frosted glass globe effect. The sunlight from space is hitting the top of this incredibly thick, relentlessly wet atmosphere, and the light is just getting scattered and diffused all the way down to the surface.
That's it.
But that raises a massive question. If the water is just suspended in the air, and there are no moving cloud systems, that means there is no rain.
Right.
How does anything survive? How do plants grow? The Genesis text specifically mentions a mist that rose from the earth to water the ground.
It does.
But how does the actual physics of a rainless, watered world work?
It works through a very specific thermodynamic engine, something the sources refer to as the dew cycle.
Dew cycle.
Yes, and this mechanism relies entirely on another massive physical parameter that the UTGH assigns to the pre-flood world zero axial tilt.
Zero tilt. Okay, so the Earth is currently tilted at about 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the sun. That's why we have seasons, right?
That's precisely why we have seasons. In the summer, your hemisphere is physically tilted toward the sun, receiving more direct solar radiation. In winter, it is tilted away.
Makes sense.
But if a planet has zero axial tilt, meaning its axis of rotation is perfectly perpendicular to its orbit, there are no seasons. None.
None at all.
The climate remains completely uniform from the equator all the way up to the higher latitudes. The temperature at any given location remains relatively constant year-round.
Okay, so if you don't have seasons, you don't have extreme temperature clashes, you don't have a mass of cold Arctic air sweeping down and colliding with warm, moist tropical air.
Which means you do not have weather fronts. You do not have the extreme atmospheric turbulence that drives our modern storm systems and rainfall.
Wow.
Instead, because the planet is in a state of uniform equilibrium, it operated on a very simple, predictable daily temperature cycle.
Walk us through what a typical 24 hours would actually look and feel like in this world.
Well, during the daytime, the sun warms that thick 1.8 atmosphere, moisture-heavy column of air, as well as the surface of the Earth.
Right.
Because the environment is so dense, an enormous amount of moisture is suspended invisibly as a gas. It's incredibly humid.
Hey.
Then the sun goes down.
And it gets cold.
Night falls, and without the incoming solar radiation, the ambient temperature drops.
Just a standard nighttime cooling.
Yes, but the crucial mechanism here is the dew point. As the temperature drops below the dew point, the air is physically incapable of holding all that suspended moisture.
So where does it go?
The laws of thermodynamics force the water vapor to condense out of the air. It condenses directly onto every single physical surface, the plants, the soil, the rocks.
Oh. This is the mist rising from the earth that the ancient texts describe.
Exactly. Every single night, across the entire globe, a massive silent hydration event occurs. It pulls moisture out of the saturated air and soaks the ground.
And then morning comes.
The sun comes up, the temperature rises back above the dew point, and all that liquid moisture on the surface evaporates right back up into the thick atmospheric column.
Recharging the sky for the next night.
It is a continuous, perfectly balanced, closed-loop cycle.
That is just staggering to visualize. When I was reading the sources, they used this wet feet analogy to explain it.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, like if you walk out onto your lawn early in the morning in the middle of summer, your shoes get completely soaked. Your lawn didn't need a rainstorm to be watered, just needed moisture-carrying air and a nighttime temperature drop.
Precisely.
And what is so mind-bending is taking that tiny suburban microclimate and extrapolating it to the entire planet. The sources suggest there was a single continuous supercontinent Pangea running this exact same hydroponic-like cycle every single night without exception.
It's a beautifully efficient system.
No unpredictable droughts, no desiccating winds, no dry seasons where the crops fail. Just a relentless, perfectly calibrated greenhouse.
It is a biome optimized for maximum growth. But if we extrapolate what that means for the visual landscape, for what a human being would actually see when they looked around, it is almost alien to our experience.
How so?
Well, because of the density of the 1.8 atmosphere air and the constant thick diffusion of moisture, the sky wouldn't be the deep, crisp, clear blue that we know.
What color would it be?
It would be a pervasive atmospheric luminescence, a sourceless, glowing illumination overhead.
A sourceless illumination. So if you were walking around at noon, you wouldn't see a sharp, distinct shadow of yourself on the ground.
You wouldn't. The light would be coming from everywhere at once.
That's so strange.
And you certainly wouldn't look up and see the clear, sharp, blinding disk of the sun. It would just be a brighter region in a glowing dome.
And at night?
At night, you wouldn't see a sharp, starry sky. The atmosphere was simply too thick and too saturated with moisture to allow the faint light of distant stars to penetrate clearly to the surface.
Which brings us right back to our original question, right back to the rainbow.
Yes.
If the sky is a diffused, glowing, frosted dome, you have zero direct point source sunlight. And if the planet waters itself via surface condensation every night, you have absolutely no falling discrete raindrops.
The two fundamental ingredients for a rainbow literally do not exist.
It's not magic, it's just the physical constraints of that specific atmosphere.
Exactly. The rainbow was impossible because the conditions that produce it were suppressed by the density and stability of the pre-flood sky.
But a denser, uniformly warm, relentlessly wet atmosphere doesn't just change the weather. You don't just change the air pressure and the humidity and expect life to remain the same.
Biology has to adapt.
Right. This fundamentally alters the physical structure, the scale, and the capability of every living thing growing inside it. What happens when you put biology into that specific pressure cooker?
This is where the UTGH framework becomes truly fascinating, because it uses these atmospheric parameters to solve some of the most persistent, frustrating mysteries in paleontology and the fossil record.
Okay, let's get into the giants.
So we've established the pressure at 1.8 atmospheres, but the sources also design the chemical composition of that air. They place oxygen levels between 30 to 35% compared to our current 21%.
That is a massive jump in oxygen.
It is. And carbon dioxide is placed between 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million, which is exponentially higher than our current level of about 420 parts per million. Finally, they calculate a slightly reduced surface gravity, placing it at 9.68 meters per second squared, which is roughly 1% lower than today's gravity.
Okay, wait. So we have higher pressure, significantly higher oxygen, a massive load of carbon dioxide, and slightly lower gravity. Let's start with the plants, because they are the foundation of any food web. What does a plant do with 2,000 parts per million of CO2 and no winter?
It grows at terrifying speeds.
I can imagine.
High carbon dioxide levels combined with a uniform, seasonless, constantly hydrated climate led to maximum photosynthetic productivity. Plants breathe CO2. In that environment, they were pulling massive amounts of carbon from the air and growing continuously without ever having to pause for a winter dormancy or a dry season.
Wow.
This produced an unprecedented, almost unimaginable volume of biomass.
Which you absolutely need if you are going to feed a Brachiosaurus.
That is the biological bottleneck. The food supply is always the limiting factor for giant herbivores. If you look at a 70-ton sauropod, the daily caloric intake required just to keep that animal alive is astronomical.
They'd just be eating 204/7.
Many paleontologists have pointed out that the current Earth vegetation simply could not sustain herds of these massive animals. They would strip a forest bare and starve.
But a pre-flood greenhouse world.
Exactly. Operating at maximum photosynthetic capacity year-round, it could produce the necessary volume of food to sustain that kind of megafauna.
And it isn't just about the food supply. The framework argues that the internal physics of these animals, how their bodies actually operated, only makes sense in that specific atmosphere.
This is a concept called multi-constraint convergence.
Okay.
Let's stick with the Brachiosaurus and look at its 30-foot neck. In our current environment 1.0 atmosphere, and our current gravity pumping heavy blood up a 30-foot vertical pipe against gravity requires a heart so massive and blood pressure so incredibly high that the biology begins to strain credulity.
The hydrostatic pressure alone is a nightmare. I read that if a brachiosaurus in our atmosphere lowered its head to drink water, the rush of high-pressure blood should theoretically blow out the blood vessels in its brain.
It's like a water tower collapsing.
Yeah.
But if you apply a 1.8 atmosphere pressure environment, that thicker, denser air pushes against the body of the animal. It provides substantial venous assist, essentially helping to push the blood back up the neck, acting like a pressurized flight suit.
Oh, wow.
Combine that external pressure assist with a 1% reduction in gravity, and suddenly the cardiovascular requirements drop out of the realm of the impossible and right back into normal, viable biological parameters.
The atmosphere itself acts like a full-body compression sleeve for the animal. That is amazing.
And that exact same physics solves the flight mechanics of giant pterosaurs, like the Quetzalcoatlus.
Oh, this is the one with the wingspan of an F-16 fighter jet.
Yes, an animal with a 35-foot wingspan, weighing up to 250 kilograms.
That shouldn't fly.
By standard aerodynamic models applied to our current thin atmosphere, an animal that heady simply cannot generate enough lift to take off, let alone sustain powered flight. They would just be trapped on the ground. But the lift equation in aerodynamics is directly dictated by air density. In an atmosphere nearly twice as dense as ours, with a slight decrease in gravity, the lift equation is exponentially improved. In that world, Quetzalcoatlus doesn't just manage to fly, it flies comfortably and efficiently.
Okay, I have to bring up the bugs, because this part gave me the creeps, but it is so cool. The fossil record shows giant insects like dragonflies with 30-inch wingspans, millipedes the size of alligators. How does a bug get that big?
The expert texts mention Fick's law of diffusion here, right?
Yes. Fick's law.
Can you give me the ELI 5, explained like a 5 version of how bugs breathe?
Certainly. Insects do not have lungs like mammals do. They breathe through a tracheal system, which is basically a network of tiny tubes running from the outside of their bodies deep into their tissues.
Okay, just little tubes.
They rely entirely on the passive diffusion of oxygen down those tubes. According to Fick's law, the rate of diffusion depends on the concentration gradient.
In our current atmosphere, at 21% oxygen at 1.0 pressure, an insect can only get so big before the oxygen simply cannot diffuse deeply or quickly enough to reach its inner organs, and the insect suffocates.
So the atmosphere sets a hard limit on bug size.
Yes, but at 1.8 atmospheres and 35% oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen is vastly higher. This immense pressure physically drives the oxygen much deeper and faster into the tracheal tubes, completely lifting that biological ceiling on insect size.
That's wild.
The physics of the pre-flood atmosphere literally permit the giants to exist.
That makes perfect sense. But let's shift from the fauna back to the flora, specifically the trees. The sources make a massive, highly specific point about the gopher wood that was used to build Noah's Ark.
This is a great point.
In Genesis, God tells Noah to make the ark out of gopher wood. Now, biblical scholars and botanists have debated for centuries what species of tree that actually translates to. Is it cypress? Is it cedar? Is it some extinct pine? But the sources argue that everyone is asking the wrong question. Gopher wood isn't a lost species. They argue it is a lost condition.
And this ties directly back to what we discussed about zero axial tilt.
The lack of seasons.
Because a pre-flood world had absolutely no seasons, the trees experienced no annual stress cycles. In our current world, a tree grows very rapidly during the warm, wet spring and early summer.
Right, producing lots of soft wood.
Exactly. This rapid growth produces lighter, less dense, porous wood called early wood. Then, as autumn and winter approach, the temperature drops, moisture decreases, and the tree's growth slows down dramatically.
Okay.
This slow growth produces a very thin, dense, dark band of wood called late wood. This alternating cycle of early wood and late wood is what creates the tree rings we are all familiar with.
But a tree ring isn't just a marker of age. It's actually a physical weak point in the timber, isn't it?
It is a significant structural vulnerability. The transition zone between the porous early wood and the dense late wood creates a microfracture plane.
Oh, I never thought of it that way.
It is a seam of inconsistent density running through the entire length of the timber. If you stress a piece of wood, it will almost always snap along those ring boundaries. But in the pre-flood world, with a constant temperature and constant daily moisture from the dew cycle, trees never experienced winter.
They never went dormant.
They never went dormant. They just grew continuously and evenly all year round.
So the result would be timber with absolutely no annual rings.
Exactly. It would be incredibly dense, structurally uniform, and orders of magnitude stronger than anything we can grow today.
So gopher wood was just pre-flood timber. It was the material consequence of a seasonless world. And because that climate ended with the flood, the material ended with it. You couldn't grow gopher wood today if you tried. The winter would force rings into it.
Precisely.
And what blew my mind is that the framework actually makes a highly specific, testable prediction about this involving the oldest living trees on Earth, the giant sequoias in California.
Yes, this is where the theory moves from textual analysis to testable paleobotany.
Tell me about this.
The framework proposes that if you were to take a core sample of the very oldest surviving giant sequoia trees that theoretically might have sprouted in the final years before the flood and somehow survived the event, you should find something standard dendrochronology has never even thought to look for.
What is it?
Deep inside the center of the trunk, before the very first annual tree ring, there should be a measurable zone of perfectly ring-free wood grown during the pre-flood conditions.
And it gets even more specific. They predict that the exact boundary layer between that ring-free core wood and the very first true annual ring, the ring that was forced to form in the first brutal winter after the catastrophe, should contain a chemical anomaly.
Yes.
Specifically, a microscopic spike in iridium.
Iridium is an element that is very rare in Earth's surface crust, but it is abundant in deep mantle material and in asteroids.
Okay, so how does it get into the tree?
As we will discuss shortly, the rupture event that caused the flood would have loaded the atmosphere with massive amounts of subcrustal ejecta containing trace amounts of iridium. The very first post-flood tree rings, forming as the atmosphere was choked with this dust, would have absorbed this iridium from the environment.
That is just...
So the specific prediction is a physical, chemical archive of the exact moment the world's climate permanently changed, locked deep inside a living tree.
That is a staggering claim, and it's completely testable. The core samples exist in university drawers right now, just waiting for someone to run them through a mass spectrometer.
They do.
Okay, so I am tracking with the giant bugs, the dinosaurs, the indestructible wood, but I need to pause and issue some genuine pushback here.
Sure, go ahead.
Because it's one thing to say a thick atmosphere let a dragonfly get huge, but if this atmosphere was so perfectly tuned, wouldn't it have had a massive, undeniable effect on human biology too?
Well, yes.
Are we really supposed to believe that breathing thick, wet air makes a human being live to be 900 years old? That sounds like a massive leap from paleontology into pure mythology.
It does sound like a leap, until you look at the fundamental biology of how and why cellular aging actually occurs. And that brings us to the human element of this model.
Okay, lay it out for me.
If you read the genealogies in Genesis, or if you look at secular, extra-biblical, historical documents like the Sumerian King List, you see records of human beings living to seemingly absurd ages.
Adam lived to 930, Methuselah to 969, Noah to 950.
Right. Modern readers almost universally dismiss these as symbolic numbers, perhaps counting months as years, or just mythological exaggerations meant to convey importance.
Sure.
But the UTGH framework argues these are literal biological outputs of the pre-flood sky.
Okay, break that down for me. How does the sky dictate how long I live?
To understand why, we have to look at the primary environmental drivers of aging, cellular degradation, and germline mutation. Why do our bodies break down?
Lots of reasons, right?
Yes, but a massive part of the answer is environmental radiation, specifically ultraviolet, UV radiation from the sun, and cosmic rays from deep space. UVB radiation is highly energetic. When it hits your skin, it is directly absorbed by your DNA. This absorption causes structural damage to the DNA molecule.
The sources mention something called cyclobutane pyrimidine dimers. Can you translate that? What is a dimer actually doing to my DNA? Is it like a kink in a zipper?
That is a very accurate analogy. DNA is a double helix, held together by rungs of base pairs.
Right.
When UVB radiation hits it, it can cause two adjacent bases, specifically pyrimidines like thymine or cytosine, to covalently bond to each other instead of to their partners across the helix.
Ouch.
It creates a physical kink, a dimer, in the genetic zipper. When your cells try to replicate, that kink causes errors. Now, our cells have complex machinery to repair this damage, but the repair process isn't perfect. Over time, the damage accumulates.
And the relentless wear and tear process on our genetic code, driven by the sky above us.
Precisely. But the pre-flood environment, according to the sources, featured two massive defensive shields that practically eliminated this damage.
What was the first shield?
First, that 1.8 atmosphere column of air, heavily laden with water vapor. Water is an incredible radiation shield. That thick, wet sky was highly effective at attenuating or scattering and absorbing UVB radiation.
Oh, because it was so wet.
Exactly. The surface UV exposure would have been a tiny fraction of what we endure today.
And the second shield.
The geomagnetic field. The sources proposed that the pre-flood Earth had a significantly stronger magnetic field than it does now.
Why was it stronger?
This field was amplified by a globally continuous, highly conductive layer of supercritical water trapped deep beneath the Earth's crust, the Great Deep that we will discuss in a moment. This supercharged magnetic field acted as a massive deflector shield, bouncing a much higher percentage of incoming high-energy cosmic rays back into space.
So you have almost no UV damage coming from the sun because of the wet atmosphere, and drastically reduced cosmic ray damage coming from space because of the magnetic field. The exogenous mutation rate, the cellular damage coming from outside the body, was practically zero.
As a result, cellular oxidative stress was drastically lower. The human genome in this environment was what the sources call front-loaded.
Front-loaded.
Because humanity had been recently created, the genetic code was pristine. It was operating at near minimum error rates, retaining its maximum informational fidelity across centuries of cell replication.
Wow.
If you remove the primary environmental drivers of DNA damage, the biological clock runs entirely differently. The framework argues that a lifespan of 9 centuries wasn't a miracle. It was simply the physiological baseline for a human operating in that specific, highly shielded environment.
I want you, the listener, to try and imagine that. Imagine living a life where aging isn't a rapid collapse in your 70s, but a slow, almost imperceptible process over centuries, simply because the sky itself is protecting your DNA.
It's a very different human experience.
But then the sky breaks. The shield is suddenly removed. What happens to human biology when it is suddenly exposed to a stripped, unshielded atmosphere? The sources point to the post-flood genealogies to answer this, and this is where the math gets genuinely spooky.
The data points are very clear, and they form a distinct pattern. Noah lives to 950 years old. Crucially, he was born before the flood and lived the vast majority of his life in the shielded pre-flood world.
Right.
But look at the generations born after the flood who lived entirely in the new, unshielded, high-radiation environment. Noah's son Shem lives to 600. A few generations later, Peleg lives to 239.
It's dropping fast.
A few more generations, Abraham lives to 175. Eventually, by the time of Moses, the lifespan settles into the familiar 70 to 120-year range we know today.
It's a mathematical decay curve.
Yes, exactly.
It is biology reacting to a sudden, catastrophic environmental step change. If these numbers in Genesis were just symbolic myths, they would be round, culturally significant numbers that stay static, like every king living exactly 1,000 years.
But they don't.
No. What the text actually records is a noisy, directional, exponential decline. It is exactly what you would expect to see from a real biological population desperately adapting to a new, much harsher environment.
The accumulation of genomic damage compounds generation by generation. It isn't just that the post-flood individuals are exposed to more radiation in their own lifetimes, is that they are inheriting germline DNA that has already been damaged and degraded by the previous generation's exposure.
Oh, that makes sense.
The genetic baseline is lowering with every birth.
And the sources bring in a brilliant, very human example of this from the text, the stories of Sarah and Elizabeth.
This is a great comparison.
Sarah is Abraham's wife in the Old Testament. She is told she will have a child at the age of 90, and her reaction is to laugh out loud. She finds it biologically absurd. In her generation, the rules were shifting fast.
Right. She was past the age of childbearing by the decaying standards of her day.
But her body experienced a temporary suspension of those new rules.
And if we move the timeline forward about 60 generations to the New Testament, we find the story of Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist.
Exactly. Elizabeth is also described in the text as being advanced in years and experiencing a miraculous pregnancy. But Elizabeth wasn't 90.
No.
She was what we would consider normal middle age, maybe in her 50s or 60s. The threshold for what was considered too old or advanced in years had compressed from Sarah's 90 down to Elizabeth's 50.
Over 60 generations, the boundary of human vitality has shrunk.
It tracks the mathematical decay curve perfectly, not in abstract demographic numbers, but in the lived physical experience of these women.
It is a profound argument. The framework suggests that the ancient texts are not recording abstract theology in these moments. They are recording observable, rapidly shifting human biology.
Okay, so we have built this world. We have a perfectly calibrated, giant-producing, life-extending greenhouse world, a world of growing skies, 70-ton herbivores, ring-free gopher wood, and 900-year-old humans. But we know it didn't last.
No, it didn't.
How exactly did it end? And more importantly, how did it end in a way that produced the first rainbow as a direct physical consequence?
The most critical thing to understand about the flood event, according to the physical mechanics of the UTGH framework, is that it was not a weather event.
Not a storm.
It wasn't a really bad storm. In fact, the rain did not cause the flood.
I need you to pause and say that again. The rain didn't cause the flood.
The flood was a geological detonation. The rain was merely a byproduct. We mentioned earlier that beneath the Earth's solid granite crust, there was a globally continuous subterranean layer of water.
Right.
Because this water was trapped under miles of solid rock, it was subjected to extreme pressure and intense geothermal heat. It existed in a state that physicists call a supercritical fluid.
What does supercritical actually mean in this context?
When you heat water to extreme temperatures, it wants to become steam. But if it is confined under immense pressure and cannot expand, it reaches a state where distinct liquid and gas phases do not exist.
That's hard to picture.
It behaves like a fluid, with the density of a liquid but the permeability of a gas. It is incredibly volatile and holds a massive amount of stored kinetic energy.
The fountains of the great deep, as Genesis calls them. But if this supercritical water layer was stable enough to support a biosphere for potentially thousands of years, why did it suddenly break?
The trigger, the sources argue, was not on Earth. It was the moon. Specifically, a process called lunar tidal heating.
The moon caused the flood.
Just as the moon's gravity pulls on our oceans today, causing the tides to rise and fall, the moon's gravity pulled on the solid rock crust of the pre-flood Earth.
Pulling the rock itself.
Every single day, as the Earth rotated, the massive granite crust was pulled upward slightly and then relaxed. It flexed.
So it's like taking a metal paper clip and bending it back and forth. You bend it once, it's fine. You bend it twice, it's fine. But eventually, the metal fatigues.
Exactly. Over billions of lunar cycles, this continuous microscopic flexing caused immense friction and fatigue in the crustal rock.
That makes sense.
This isn't just theory. It is a known physical process. We see it happening today on Jupiter's moon Io, where tidal flexing from Jupiter creates massive internal heat and continuous violent volcanism.
Okay, so Earth's crust is fatiguing.
On Earth, this tidal flexure fatigue accumulated over the entire pre-flood geological period. Slowly, microscopically, networks of cracks propagated downward through the crust toward that highly pressurized supercritical water chamber.
And because it's happening miles underground, nobody on the surface felt it coming. The sky was still glowing. The dew cycle was still running.
Until the day the crack network finally reached the supercritical chamber.
Oh.
When the structural integrity of the crust finally failed, the confining pressure was catastrophically released. The supercritical water, seeking the path of least resistance, exploded upward through the crack.
Wow.
Because of the extreme pressure it was under, it didn't just bubble out like a hot spring. It erupted at hypersonic velocity.
How fast?
The sources calculate exit speeds of between 47 to 93 kilometers per second.
That is insane.
It was a planetary-scale detonation, propagating along the fault lines like a zipper opening violently around the globe.
Okay, I want to trace the physics of what happens next because this is where the sky breaks. You have this hypersonic jet of supercritical water, steam, and pulverized rock shooting miles up into the sky.
Yes.
It slams into that incredibly dense 1.8 atmosphere column of air that, as we established, is completely saturated with invisible water vapor. What happens to the sky when it gets hit by that?
The pressure wave from that hypersonic detonation violently compressed the atmospheric column. This compression was so sudden and so incredibly intense that it instantly stripped the suspended moisture out of the air.
Oh.
The invisible water vapor was forced to condense into liquid rain immediately.
So the flood caused the rain, the explosion squeezed the sky like a sponge.
Yes. The text mentions 40 days and 40 nights of rain. According to this framework, that rain was literally driven out of the atmosphere by the shock wave of the crustal rupture.
Before the underground water even hit the ground again.
Exactly, likely falling before the bulk of the subcrustal water itself even fell back to the surface. It was the first rain the planet had ever experienced, and it represented the total, permanent collapse of the pre-flood atmosphere.
It's like taking a warm, highly pressurized bottle of carbonated water, shaking it violently, and then smashing it with a hammer.
Great analogy.
The sudden release of pressure causes an instant phase change. The gas turns to liquid, the liquid expands. And in physics, when you have rapid expansion of a gas, there is a massive thermal reaction, right?
A catastrophic thermal reaction. The physics of this expansion requires a process called adiabatic cooling.
Adiabatic cooling.
Yes. As the highly compressed water vapor and steam were expelled into the upper atmosphere and suddenly expanded to much lower pressures, their temperature plummeted instantly.
How cold are we talking?
We are talking about localized temperature crashes dropping below -100 degrees Celsius within minutes.
Minus 100 degrees. That isn't just cold, that is outer space cold.
This extreme cooling creates localized, supersonic downdrafts of freezing air flash freezes on the surface. And this mechanism solves another major long-standing paleontology puzzle,
Which is?
the Siberian mammoths.
Right, I've read about this. They find these massive woolly mammoths buried in the permafrost, completely intact.
Not just intact, we have found fully fleshed mammoths frozen in the ice with fresh, undigested, temperate vegetation like buttercups still in their mouths and stomachs.
Oh, it's crazy.
Now think about the thermodynamics of that. For an animal of that sheer thermal mass, 6 tons of warm meat to freeze completely solid before the food in its stomach can even begin to decompose requires a temperature drop of unimaginable speed and severity.
Right, a slow freeze wouldn't do it.
A slow climate shift into an ice age cannot do it. If the weather just gets slowly colder over centuries, the mammoth either migrates south or it dies and rots on the tundra.
It doesn't freeze with buttercups in its mouth.
But a localized adiabatic flash, freeze from a collapsing atmosphere, freezes them exactly where they stand, mid-chew.
The sky didn't just rain, it collapsed, and it flash froze everything underneath the expansion zones. The violence of this event is almost impossible to picture.
It's apocalyptic.
You have supersonic geysers, the sky turning to water, and pockets of absolute zero air slamming into the ground. But eventually the rupture finished. The subcrustal chambers emptied, the eruptions ceased, and the waters began to recede. And when the survivors, Noah and his family, stepped out of the ark, they stepped out into a completely unrecognizable universe. The framework argues that the very dimensions of the planet had changed.
The physical architecture of the Earth was completely altered. When that massive, globally continuous subcrustal water reservoir was expelled onto the surface, it left a massive void beneath the crust.
Like a deflated balloon.
The granite crust, no longer supported by the pressurized water, collapsed inward to find a new structural equilibrium.
The Earth literally shrank.
Yes. The UTGH framework calculates that this massive crustal collapse reduced the Earth's radius by approximately 46 kilometers.
46 kilometers.
And this triggers a fundamental law of physics. The conservation of angular momentum. It is the classic figure skater analogy.
Oh, right, when they pull their arms in.
When a spinning figure skater extends her arms, she spins slowly. When she pulls her arms inward, decreasing her radius, she spins much faster. When the Earth's crust collapsed inward, reducing its radius by 46 kilometers, the planet began to spin faster on its axis.
And this changes the calendar. This was one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the sources.
I agree, it's fascinating.
They point out that virtually every ancient calendar tradition, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Vedic, the Persian, the Mayan, all of them originally built their calendars on a 360-day year, 12 months of exactly 30 days.
Right.
And every single one of those disparate cultures later had to awkwardly amend their calendars, adding 5 intercalary days at the end of the year because their calendars no longer matched the reality of the sky.
It is not a coincidence, and it is not a primitive rounding error. It is the rotational scar of the rupture event.
Wow.
The pre-flood Earth, with its larger radius, took exactly 360 days to complete a solar orbit. The post-flood Earth, smaller and spinning faster, takes 365.25 days to complete the exact same orbit.
So the orbit didn't change, just the spin?
The orbital path around the Sun didn't change. The speed of the Earth's spin did.
So the Earth is smaller and it is spinning faster. What else changed?
Well, the violence of the hypersonic expulsion wasn't perfectly uniform. Pushing unevenly against the crust, the force of the eruption shifted the Earth's axis. That perfect zero-axial tilt which had sustained the uniform greenhouse world was gone.
The Earth tilted.
The Earth was knocked off balance, finally settling at a 23.5-degree tilt.
Which means, for the first time in planetary history, we have seasons, just as Genesis says right after the flood. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter.
The uniform greenhouse was utterly destroyed. The atmosphere was vastly different now.
Because the moisture was gone.
It was thinner, having dropped from 1.8 atmospheres down to the 1.0 atmosphere we experience today. It was completely stripped of its continuous moisture burden. The nightly dew cycle was dead. And the new, thinner sky was heavily loaded with volcanic aerosols, mineral dust, and ash from the rupture.
So it was dark and it was cold.
Which created a massive thermodynamic imbalance across the globe. Think about the conditions immediately after the flood. You had the post-flood oceans, which were now incredibly warm because they had been filled with the superheated, supercritical water from the subcrustal chambers.
Hot oceans.
And you had a new, cold, aerosol-darkened atmosphere sitting right above them. Warm water evaporates rapidly into cold air. This immense volume of moisture was carried by the new seasonal wind patterns toward the poles, where the cold air caused it to fall not as rain, but as snow.
Gots of snow.
Unrelenting, massive snowfall. This is the thermal engine of the rapid ice age. It wasn't a slow orbital shift over tens of thousands of years. It was a violent heat engine driven by the catastrophe, lasting for centuries until the warm oceans finally cooled down to their modern temperatures.
Okay, bring us back to the human element. Bring us back to Noah. He opens the door and steps off the ark.
Okay.
The air hits him, and it is brutally thin, and it is cold. A biting sensation he has never felt in his 600 years of life. The sky is no longer that warm, heavy, diffused, glowing, frosted dome.
It's clear.
The volcanic dust is beginning to clear, and for the first time in his life, the sky is harsh, clear, and transparent. He can look up and see the blinding, direct, piercing disk of the sun. And then a localized seasonal weather front moves through. A rainstorm passes, dropping discrete, falling, suspended water droplets into the air.
And the optical geometry finally aligns. For the very first time in the history of the planet, direct, unbroken point source sunlight hits discrete, suspended water droplets.
The physics can work now.
The light enters the droplet. It slows down and refracts. It reflects off the back of the droplet. It refracts a second time as it exits, separating into its component wavelengths. And it travels back to Noah's eye at exactly 42 degrees.
A rainbow appears.
It is the very first one. It could not have physically existed before that exact moment because the atmosphere that prevented it was gone forever.
This is the conclusion of the arc, right here.
Okay.
This answers the question we asked at the very beginning. The sources make a profound, incredibly specific claim. God did not point to an existing natural phenomenon, a rainbow that Noah had seen a million times before, and just assign it a new poetic meaning.
Right. It wasn't, hey, look at that pretty thing. Now it means I won't flood the earth.
No. The rainbow was visible proof, written in the brand new laws of light and water, that the physics of the world had fundamentally broken and been rebuilt.
The covenant was written into the mechanics of the new atmosphere. The presence of the rainbow proved to Noah that the conditions of the pre-flood world, the dense, diffused, rainless sky that allowed the great deep to build up such catastrophic pressure in the first place, no longer existed.
The physics that caused the flood were gone.
The rainbow was the physical receipt of a newly engineered planet.
It is genuinely breathtaking when you put all the pieces together. Let's look back at the journey we just took. We started with a rainless, high-pressure greenhouse world.
A very different Earth.
A world with zero axial tilt, where a 1.8 atmosphere sky acted as a massive UV shield and a global temperature regulator. It was a world engineered to produce 70-ton giants, dragonflies the size of hawks, perfectly dense, ring-free gopher wood, and humans who lived for 9 centuries without their DNA degrading.
And we tracked how that world was systematically destroyed by the relentless fatigue of lunar tides, culminating in a catastrophic crustal detonation.
A hypersonic expulsion of supercritical water that collapsed the atmosphere, flash froze the mammoths, and permanently shrank the physical radius of the planet.
Leaving us with a tilted, faster-spinning, colder planet.
A world of harsh seasons, of unpredictable weather fronts, of genetic decay, and of an atmosphere thin enough that direct sunlight could finally pierce a rainstorm.
It's an incredible framework.
I want to talk directly to you, the listener, for a moment as we wrap this up. What this deep dive really shows is how profoundly a single physical detail, the refraction of light in water, the geometric requirement for a rainbow, can be used to reverse engineer an entire lost biosphere.
It's all connected.
Whether you take it as literal history or as a fascinating thought experiment, it forces you to look at the world around you differently.
It connects the simple optics of a summer rainstorm to the biology of a dinosaur, the molecular structure of ancient wood, and the orbital mechanics of our calendar. It is a unified theory in the truest sense of the word, tying the microscopic to the cosmic.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over today. The next time you see a rainbow, I want you to consider this framework.
Think about the calendar.
Yes, think about the fact that our year has 365 and a quarter days, but our geometry, the way we measure a perfect circle, is still exactly 360 degrees. Why? It is a ghost of the ancient calendar, A cultural memory of the world before the rupture, hiding in our high school math classes.
A mathematical fossil.
According to these sources, that rainbow isn't just a promise of what won't happen again. It is the visible optical scar of a planet that is literally spinning faster and smaller than the one humanity was born on. What else is hiding in plain sight in the sky above you?